Hello friends, it's Jessica. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking through my top 10 books of 2024. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm very excited. I have been procrastinating this video and the order of my books for literally weeks, but I feel like I have arrived on an order that is going to kind of represent my reading year. I did keep it to 10 books, but I do have 2 honorable mentions. I'm just going to be honest, I could not pare it down any more than that. If you are noticing that I am in a different place, I have spent the last week and a half of my winter break transforming one of the bedrooms in my house into an actual library, and I will have a video about that coming up. So please stay tuned for that and subscribe if you are interested in seeing the rest of the room, because I am so excited. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with my 2 honorable mentions. So the first honorable mention that I have is a book that I read fairly recently, and I did give this book 5 stars. Everything here is 5 stars, so that's it for me talking about ratings. Just know that all these books were 5 stars. And my first honorable mention is going to be Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang. I really loved this book when I read it this year. It is the story of Siona. She is a female mage in a society where women are typically not allowed to become mages, and she's actually a high mage. At the beginning of the book, she passes this rigorous test to prove that she can hang with the rest of the mages, right? It's an amazing book. It is a commentary on colonialism, on sexism, on racism, on a lot of things that are bad in our own society through the lens of this fantasy world. As she enters into this high magedom, that's not a word, as she enters into the university and she takes her office, she's clearly not welcome. And she is assigned a research assistant who is actually someone who is of a class that is much lower than her. And we start to learn about the cracks in the society. We start to learn about the people who are maybe not as welcome as some of the other people who live in this world. And when the reveals come, and they do come, it is so hard-hitting. It is so impactful. It's emotional. I really loved it. It didn't quite make the cut for my top 10 just because I read so many amazing books this year. But if you love fantasy that has a real social commentary aspect to it, particularly I would say if you were a fan of something like Babel, I would compare this to Babel. It's perhaps a little bit more subtle in its themes than I think Babel was. I also love Babel. And I just think it's really fantastic. And I have read both of her main novels, and by far this is my favorite one. Blood Over Brighthaven, first honorable mention. The second book I have as an honorable mention is one that I don't own, and it is You Should Be So Lucky by Cat Sebastian. This is a LGBT romance that is set in the 1960s. The romance takes place between a baseball player playing on a fictional professional baseball team in New York City and a reporter who is not usually a sports reporter, but who is actually assigned to cover this player and the difficulties that he has been having in transferring to this new team. He's actually like the worst player in the league, even though he was amazing before he came here. And a lot of that is because of the internal turmoil that he has. Part of that is that he has to hide his attraction to other men. And so the book deals with those themes. It deals with what it was like to be a gay man in New York City in the 1960s, and I think a very realistic way, while also giving the sweetest love story that I have read in some time. This was easily my favorite romance this year. I loved both of the characters. They were amazing together. They were damaged. I cried. I don't even know. It was so romantic. It was so lovely. Cat Sebastian is amazing. She is somebody who can really write a historical LGBT romance in a way that feels very real. It feels very realistic to the times that they were set in, and I really appreciate that. It's kind of a more realistic look at what it would have been like to live in that world, and this book is fantastic. If you are looking for a romance read that is going to give you all the feels, then I really recommend You Should Be So Lucky. Okay, so now we are getting into my actual top 10, and I don't have the figures with me, but I know that I like to give 5-star ratings. I am a 5-star rater. If I really love something and it made me have all the feels, I am going to give it 5 stars. But that doesn't mean all of those 5-star books are going to make it into my top books of the year. So I have tried to narrow it down. I've probably forgotten some amazing books that I really loved from this year, but these are just kind of the ones that really stuck with me. In this list, I have 2 fantasies, 1 horror, 3 literary fictions, and 4 science fiction books. So I read such a huge variety of books this year, and I had such a hard time narrowing it down. I actually read more fantasy than anything else, so it was interesting to me that fantasy did not end up with the most books in my top 10, but as you will see, I read some fantasies that I really, really enjoyed. So let's go ahead and get started with book number 10, which is going to be The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. I absolutely love this book. It is a horror novel that is set in Florida in, I think it's the 1950s, and it concerns a reform school that is based on a real reform school for boys, for African-American boys, that existed in Florida at that time. The author, Tananarive Due, actually had a personal connection to the school that this was based on. She had a great uncle that she came to find out had actually lived and died in this school. And through this story, she tells the story of all of these boys, African-American boys, who were placed in this school unjustly, treated horribly, and often died, and their stories were just left untold. This is a horror book, but I would say that if you are afraid of scary books, this would actually be a good one for you. This is definitely one of those, and I know it's a cliche, but this is definitely one of those books where I would say, the people are more scary than the ghosts or the monsters, and it is certainly true in this book. Our main character in this book is Robbie. Robbie is a young boy who has been sentenced to this reform school after he gets into a fight with a white boy over the white boy's treatment of his sister Gloria. Gloria is the other main character in this. We see her efforts to get Robbie out of the reformatory, but the main part of the story does take place inside the reformatory. While we are there, we meet all the other boys, we meet the staff. We learn that in this property, it is quite haunted by the ghosts of people who have perished unjustly in the reformatory over the time that it has been open. And Robbie is someone who can see these ghosts, and that's a major plot point of the story. I found this story extremely moving. I did not previously know anything about the story of African-American reform schools for children in the South, or actually I think kind of all over the country in the US, and I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't know about it because it is awful. It is something that I think we should be so ashamed of as a country, that these things actually happened. And I felt like I was not only entertained by the story, but I was educated by the author about this very real history that took place in my own country that I did not know about. So I would highly recommend this. And again, like I said, I would recommend this even if you don't think you like scary books, because this is not scary. I was not scared, although I was very worried for all of the characters the entire time. It's my first book by Tananarive Due, and I was so impressed with her writing that I definitely plan to pick up some more of her books later this year and check out some of her more traditional horror works. But this book was absolutely amazing. It was a feat. It has won a lot of awards. It deserved every single one of those awards, and I am so sorry that it took me so long to read it. I'm trying to make up for it now by recommending it as number 10 on my list. So the next book on my list is going to be literary fiction. It is one that I read in January, right at the beginning of the year. I actually thought that I had put it on my list for 2023, but it turns out I did not, and I'm rectifying that error right now by recommending In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. This is a historical fiction novel, a little bit of a romance that is set during World War I in England and in the trenches in France and things like that. This is the story of 2 boys who are at a boarding school together, who are secretly in love with each other, but do not wish to admit it because of, the time that they live in and such things as that. And they eventually end up enlisting and going away to World War I. The 2 boys in the book are named Gaunt and Elwood. They are such endearing characters in so many ways. And over the course of the book, you see them change as they are changed by their experience in the war. There's always a danger, I feel like, with historical fiction that is set during a war, that we're going to romanticize the idea of the war. And I have to tell you that this book makes very clear, in a way that not a lot of other books I have read did, exactly how bad the conditions were for the British soldier during the First World War. You are in the trenches, you are seeing and smelling and hearing all of the sounds going on. And it is absolutely horrifying and moving. And yeah, it's just, this book is a real accomplishment. I feel like I loved it. It made me cry. I rooted for these two boys. I rooted for their classmates, who you also know very well. I wanted things to turn out well for everyone, which of course, because it's a war novel, it's probably not going to. Not a spoiler. I really, really love this book. There are several covers of this. I got this one, and now none of the other ones that I've seen look like this. I think this is quite pretty. In a sense, it's a picture, of bombs going over no man's land on a battlefield in the First World War. If you have an interest in historical fiction and you have not read this book, I would definitely recommend it. I don't feel like I see enough people talking about it, and I thought that it was absolutely fantastic. Okay, my next book, which is going to be number 8 on my list, is going to be a science fiction book, and that is Service Model by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is the second Adrian Tchaikovsky book that I've read. The first one that I read was Children of Time. Yes, Children of Time. It's the spider book. This one was quite different. This is a story about a android robot named Charles, and Charles he was made to be a valet for very rich humans in this world, which we start out, we're in the house, this manor house, and something has happened to his master. Charles doesn't seem real clear on exactly what has happened to him, although, I think that we might have some idea, and we do come to find out what has happened to his master. And this sets Charles off on a journey, because the only thing he knows how to do is be a valet. And without the ability to be a valet for his master, he goes looking for work, and he finds that the world outside of the manor house is quite changed from the way that he might have expected it to be. It seems that things have not been going so great for humanity. I love this book. It has an amazing sense of humor, and Adrian Tchaikovsky is so witty. And he does something in this book that I think is really unusual. He writes each section of the book in the style of a different author. For instance, the first chapter, when we're trying to figure out what has happened to Charles's master, is actually written in the style of Agatha Christie. And we have this whole gathering in the drawing room of all the robots in the house to try and figure out what has happened by the robot chief inspector. And it is so funny and so amazing. And then once Charles sets off, we do get to a lot of other author homages in there. And he eventually ends up in, I believe the last section is in the style of Dante. And we get very philosophical about the nature of AI and robots and humanity and consciousness and all the things you expect from a robot novel. I just thought this hit so well, and I absolutely adored it. I have told myself that I'm going to be reading a lot more Adrian Tchaikovsky going forward, because I just really love this book, and it was so memorable. And if you like a little bit of humor in your science fiction, I would say it's not like Hitchhiker's Guide, but it has a little bit of that aspect. So if you like that kind of humor, probably mixed with a big dash of philosophy, then I think Service Model would be a great book to check out. Book number 7 on my list is going to be a fantasy, and that fantasy is going to be The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. I loved this book so much. It is a fantasy mystery that is kind of in the style of a Sherlock Holmes story. We have a detective named Anna, who is very much the Sherlock Holmes, and we also have a Watson character who's kind of more the main character in this story, I would say. We are trying to solve the mystery of what has happened to a very wealthy man who has been killed in a kind of a locked room mystery kind of situation. And we are also in this fantasy world where people are very much worried all the time about these leviathans who come in from the sea and attack their coasts and attack their walled cities. It's very fantastical. There's a lot going on. The magic system is very interesting. I would say this is a little bit more of a mystery than it is a fantasy in some sense. I thought the mystery was very prominent, more than the fantasy world elements, although of course it is Robert Jackson Bennett, and if you've read any of his other series, as I have, you will know that he's really good at world building, so he's really good at world building here too. But this is more about the mystery, and it is so witty. I love the Sherlock Holmes character, Anna. She's so charming. And I also have to tell you that this edition of this book is amazing, because it does not have a dust jacket. It's just this. and I love that and wish that more books would do this. The second book in this series is coming out in just a few months, and I will be reviewing it on the channel. Of course, I am so excited for that. If you have not read The Tainted Cup, I would definitely recommend checking it out, especially if you love fantasy or mystery, or if you love one of them and you want to love the other one, or if you love both of them the way that I do. Although this is the only mystery on my top 10 list this year, as I did not read a lot of mystery this year, but it was a fantastic one and I would highly recommend it. At number 6 on my list, we have another literary fiction, and this one is going to be Northwoods by Daniel Mason. This is a book that I have found so difficult to explain. Every time I sit down and I try to talk about it, I feel like I am not really explaining what makes the book special. But let me just try. Let me try to tell you what it's about. This is the story of a single piece of land in New England in the US. It follows this piece of land from Pilgrim times, basically, all the way up to actually into the future. So each chapter takes place in a different time period, and we follow the people who live on this land, who eventually live in this house that is built and then added on this land. And all the things that happen to them, all the lives they lead, the people that are important to them. Sometimes there are interludes about animals that have lived. There are some things that go through. There's certainly an apple orchard that is very important. I think of apples and apple orchards as something that are kind of quintessentially New England. And so that was very atmospheric, I felt like, for me, a person who does not live in New England. You also see the cat on the cover here. He is someone who is certainly a thoroughfare, or he and his ancestors or descendants, I guess, are something that follows through the book. But the book is told basically as a series of short stories. If you like a short story collection where all the short stories are interconnected, that's something I really enjoy, then I think you would love this. It also has a lot of pieces of kind of found material within it. Sometimes we'll have an interlude. It'll just be some letters. Sometimes I think we'll have songs, we'll have photographs that he has decided to say are part of this story. I just thought it was so clever. One thing that really surprised me was that Daniel Mason is very funny. He has a great sense of humor, and he intersperses that throughout this. There are just such wry observations about the wildlife, life in New England. I think one of my favorite quotes is something like, "You cannot keep out a porcupine. To try is folly. One must pay one's taxes sometimes." That kind of thing. That one stuck in my head. I remembered that one's one of my favorite quotes from this year. I just think it's a really fantastic book. And if you're somebody that doesn't read a lot of literary fiction, I think this is very approachable. It's not complicated in its language. It's not overly pretentious. It's easy to read. And I think that you will be entertained seeing the threads that are carried on from person to person who have all lived within this house. So highly recommended. All right, we have made it into the top 5 books of 2024, and I'm so excited to show you book number 5, which is going to be Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Moore. I absolutely loved this book. I love this whole series. I read all 3 that are already out within the calendar year. So I'm really giving you, Gideon's my favorite, but they're all good. They are all so different from anything I've ever read. I counted this as a science fiction book, but I actually think it's kind of a sci-fantasy. It is set in space, so I guess if that's your only criteria for something being a science fiction book, then yeah, this is science fiction, but it doesn't really have any science in it. It's much more about the fantasy world. It does become a little bit more sciencey as we go on, but anyway. This is the story of a world where necromancy is real, and it is the dominant magical form of the planets that the people in this world live on. Gideon lives on the 9th planet. She's a member of the 9th house, and she is a bodyguard for the princess named Harrowhark of this world, who has been sent to go to compete in this competition to try to figure out who's going to be able to be someone who is favored by the emperor. That sounds really complicated. I can tell you that Gideon does not wish to be there. Gideon is someone who is, she's really funny. She's just really funny, constant one-liners, a lot of pop culture references. You have to be okay with that kind of thing. And that is something that I think that is something that ordinarily would bother me, but it doesn't bother me here because I adore Gideon. People do say that this book is confusing. I didn't find it terribly confusing. It does have a mystery aspect, this first book. It has a little bit of a locked room mystery going on that they are all trying to solve. I was able to follow this one pretty clearly. I will say book two is pretty confusing, but for a reason, for plot reasons that you will see if you go ahead and read the series, which I would highly recommend. I think they are so unique. I don't think that I've ever read anything else that really compares to the Locked Tomb series in terms of tone, in terms of kind of the scope and just the bravery of the author to just really go there with each book and make each book completely different from the book that came before it. I love this series. I cannot wait for the final book in the series, Gideon the Ninth, to come out, although we have no idea when that's going to be. I'm going to hope for 2025, but that might be some wishful thinking, I think. But anyway, if you like funny books, if you like science fiction, if you don't mind things that are a little bit campy and over the top, I think that Gideon the Ninth would be for you, and I would highly recommend it. My number 4 book of the year is a book that I actually just finished a few weeks ago, and that is James by Percival Everett. I don't own a copy of this yet, but I am planning to pick one up very, very soon because this is a book that I found very impactful. James, if you don't know, is a retelling of the story Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of the escaped slave James. And if you read Huckleberry Finn, you know that there are large sections of the book where Huckleberry kind of goes off and does his own thing. He gets in his own adventures, and Jim is kind of left behind. This book fills in those places. It fills in what was going on with Jim at those times. It also goes, I think, beyond the book. It is not, I would say, probably necessary to have read Huckleberry Finn. You should have an idea of what the story is, but I read it probably 20 years ago, and it did not affect my enjoyment of the story whatsoever, that I had not read it recently or that I didn't remember everything that happened in it very clearly. One of the things that I think is really interesting that happens in this book, and it's not a spoiler, it happens within the first chapter, you see this happening, is that the slaves in the book all speak kind of a modern, regular English when they speak to one another, and then they dumb down their speech when they're speaking to white people to keep them from basically feeling threatened or knowing that they know these things. I wasn't sure if I would like it going into it. Again, Huckleberry Finn, haven't read it for a long time. It's not my favorite book ever, but it really was so impactful. The ending is something that I can't talk about because it's a spoiler, but the ending is something that I have seen people feel very conflicted about. And I think the thing that I would say about the ending of the book is that sometimes you try to work within a system and then find out that you can't work within the system because of the lack of power that you have. And I think that's where James kind of ends up. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But I did actually, once I had some time to discuss it with other people and think about it, really appreciated the ending of this book. And I just think it's a really important book. It just won the National Book Award. It has been everywhere. I have seen some interviews with the author that were really great. And if you're going to read one literary fiction book that came out this year, I think that James would be the one that I would definitely recommend. Now we are to book number 3. We are to my top 3 books. And this is going to be a book that I know if you've been on my channel before, you're going to have heard me talk about because for a while there, I was talking about it nonstop. And that book is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. I do not own a copy of this because I am holding out hope that I'm going to find a copy of the hardcover, which is out of print and very, very expensive if you try to buy it online. But one day I'm going to walk into a used bookstore or Goodwill and it is going to be there. It is going to happen. We are holding out hope. I do not own it. So this is the story of 2 young men. It is kind of their love story. It's also the story of them traveling across a continent with an old god to try to save their society. It is a story that is told within a play, within another story. It has multiple layers, and it's an extremely hard story to describe. Every time I try to describe this similar to Northwoods, I feel like you are not going to understand what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that this book has one of the most unique structures that I have ever seen. The author, because of the structure where you are inside this mythical playhouse and you are watching the story take place on the stage, all of the characters, the kind of like little tiny aside characters that you have within a story, are often given a point of view moment. It might just be a few sentences where they talk about what brought them to this place. Spearman number 3 is going to tell you that he wasn't even supposed to be on the line today. For instance, I don't think that actually happens, but for instance, that's a thing that could happen within this book. And I have to say that it made the world feel so alive to me. I felt like the characters were real. I felt like I was right there with them, and I loved the device. It was so moving. Made the fantasy world feel like a lot more than I think it was otherwise. Outside of that device, in some ways, the fantasy world and fantasy story of The Spear Cuts Through Water is kind of a standard story. You're saving the world. We've seen that a lot. There is a love story. The love story wasn't actually my favorite part of the book. I thought that it was fine, but it wasn't what I was reading the book for. I was reading the book for the structure of the story and for the world and the background characters. I was just so fascinated with the fact that we got to spend so much time with these background characters. And the framing device just really hit for me. And I would say you should read this book, but I would also say if you do read this book, I got a couple things I'm going to say. The first one is, please do not listen to the audiobook. I'm not saying the narrator doesn't do a good job, but I'm saying because of the structure of this book, because you have so many POV characters, you will be really confused. You will not know who is speaking. And when you look at the book, which I don't have here with me, you can actually see that there's different ways that the text delineates that. And so you could read it in ebook form or you could read it in a physical form. And I think either one would be fine. But the audiobook, I tried a little bit of it and it was so confusing. And a lot of the people that I've seen not like this book have listened to the audiobook. So I would not do audiobook on this one. And the other thing I would say is that you need to give this book at least 100 pages. For the first 100 pages, I wanted to quit. I wanted to DNF. I was like, this is the weirdest thing that I have ever read. But then it clicked and I ended up absolutely loving it, and it made my top 3 of the year. So that is my recommendation. Those are my caveats. But if you are interested at all, I just think that this is such an interesting way to write a fantasy story. And I'm definitely going to be watching out for Simon Jimenez in the future. This is only his 2nd novel, and it is such an achievement, I feel like. And I would like to see more people read this book. Okay, we are to my top 2 books of the year, and I'm so excited. I'm so excited to get to talk about them. Book number 2 is one that I read, I think in February, might have been January. It was early in the year, and it really stuck with me all year. And I know that it is a book that, again, is a little bit controversial sometimes. And that book is This Is How You Lose the Time War. This Is How You Lose the Time War is a book that is told entirely in letters. It is very short. It only has the point of view of 2 characters as they write back and forth across time, across this war, the time war that is going on in the background. And it is basically, I would say, a love story. It's a literary love story. If you love beautiful prose, if you don't mind if your prose is just a little bit over the top, then you're going to like this book. I am somebody who, I love a beautiful turn of phrase. Unless it is just ridiculous, I am almost always going to go for the pretty sounding words. There are some authors that I don't like just because I feel like their writing doesn't have any poetry to it. And this book felt like poetry. It sang the entire time. It was so good. Our main characters are Red and Blue, and those are the only names that we know them as. They are on opposite sides of the time war, which we also don't learn that much about. We don't learn a lot about how time travel works. We just know that it's a thing in this world, and you have to be okay with that. This is much closer to literary fiction than it is to traditional science fiction. If you go into this looking for science, you're not going to have a good time. If you go into it looking for beautiful prose and a beautiful love story, I think you're going to have a fantastic time. And I had a fantastic time with this book. There are so many amazing quotes from this book that I would not even know where to start with giving you a great quote. The letters that they write to each other are just top tier romance letters, like so over the top. If some of these, I think if somebody actually wrote them to you, you would be like, I think you need to dial that down a little bit. You're getting a little bit scary. But in the book, I was like, yes, yes. These characters would die for each other and then they would come back. And I don't even know. But it's such a romantic book and I recommend it so highly. If you have never read it, it's not very long and I think that you would enjoy it. And here we are, guys. It's my #1 book of the year, and I agonized over this decision. There were at least 3 books that I already talked about in this list that were previously in the #1 spot. But what I ultimately decided to do was say, what is the book that came to me this year at the exact moment that I needed that book in my life? That I needed the message, that I needed the comfort. And that book is The Last Gifts of the Universe by Riley August. This is a pretty new release. I think it came out in October. And it is a cozy science fiction story. It's not cozy in the sense that there are no stakes, but it's cozy in the sense that it just feels very cozy and very comforting. This is the story of Scout. Scout is an archivist. An archivist in her universe means that she is traveling around. She is going through all of these dead worlds because humanity has discovered other planets, but all of the other planets are dead. All of the other civilizations don't exist. There is no one except for them, but they have all had the same fate happen to them. So as an archivist, she travels to try to figure out what happened to these worlds, to try to find what they did to try to save themselves so that humanity can try to save themselves when inevitably the same thing comes for them. And that's pretty weighty, right? That's a lot. But it was told with so much heart. She's traveling around. She's on a spaceship that feels like a very cozy spaceship. And she is traveling with her brother and with their cat, the ever fearless, I think it says sometimes fearless, spacefaring cat, Pumpkin. I am not kidding when I tell you I would die for Pumpkin the cat. Pumpkin the cat, who has his own little spacesuit with his own little helmet, and they put him into it for an away mission, and he goes down and he patters around on his little little paws on the planet. And sometimes he helps, but mostly he's just there and he's a cat and he's cute. And I adored it so much. I felt like the story was really about what makes a society worthwhile. What are the things that make us human? What are the things that connect us? I read this book at a time that I think I was feeling very much like sad just about the world in general. And I felt like this book really gave me the gift that I need to remember that no matter how much I might disagree with someone within my life, or, I might be worried about stuff going on in the world, I need to remember that there's something that connects us all and that we all have a better part within us. And this book just really did that for me. It really left me with such a hopeful message about humanity, about the future, and it gave me an amazing cat to read about. And I haven't seen enough people talk about this book. I have seen a few people read it, but I'm a little bit on a mission right now to get people to read this book. It does not have enough ratings on Goodreads. It needs to have more ratings on Goodreads. I need more people to read this because there's a lot of cozy books out there, and most of them kind of don't really do it for me. But this one did. This one just made me feel like the world was a better place than I thought it was before. And that is the reason why we read books. All right. And so with that, I hope you have enjoyed watching me go through my top books of the year. And I hope that you found a few things that maybe you might want to check out. Please leave me a comment and let me know what your top book of the year was. I would love to know. I would love to read it. And if you were new here, I would love if you would stick around, check out a couple other videos, and maybe consider subscribing. And with that, I hope that you all have a fantastic new year, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.